Happy Wednesday, everyone, and welcome to Our Whole Lives Taking Flight. My name is the Reverend Amy Johnson, and I am the Minister for Sexuality, Education, and Justice in the United Church of Christ. I am coming to you today. Melanie Davis is here on site with me as well. We are at one of our outdoor ministry sites. We've been on a little owl retreat. So we just want to let you know that if the internet is lagging a little bit on our end, that is why. We'll be turning our videos off here in a minute, but I wanted to welcome you all here. We're delighted to have with us Marshall Miller and Dorian Solot today. But before we go any further, Melanie, would you introduce yourself?
Hi, folks. I'm Dr. Melanie Davis, the Unitarian Universalist Association's Our Whole Lives manager, and just happy to be here. Amy and I are working for y'all and the OWL program. Dorian, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello again. My name is Dorian Solot. I use she, her pronouns, and I am joining you all today from Marshall's in my home office in Albany, New York.
And I'm Marshall Miller, so my pronouns are he, him. So greetings from the Best Western O'Hare Airport. I'm here after having spoken in a college in Indiana last night.
Wonderful. So welcome, everyone. And I want to just say that as we are getting started this morning, first of all, yes, Holly, I am in Pilgrim Firs. We are at Pilgrim Firs in Port Orchard, Washington. If you have questions during this webinar today, if you can use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, that will greatly help us make sure that your questions get answered. It's really hard for us to follow the questions in the chat. Feel free to use the chat for the chat and for stuff that Marshall and Dorian ask you to do. But if you have questions that you want us to capture and answer later, using the Q&A feature is the best. We'll say a little bit more later on about what's coming up next for Our Whole Lives webinars, but let's get started. I'm going to turn my video off so we don't have wonkiness, and over to you, Dorian and Marshall.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thanks so much, the two of you, for hosting this. Always love these webinars. Great to be here today. Just to give you a sense of, I know many folks recognize a lot of familiar names among the attendees, so glad you're all here today. For those of you less familiar with us, just to give you a sense of who we are, I'm an OWL trainer for all levels, and the two of us are the co-authors of the second edition of the K1 curriculum, which is already out in PDF format. Looking forward to the hard copies coming soon as well.
And when Marshall and I are not thinking and writing about sex education for kids, our primary job, our day job, is teaching sex education primarily to college students. Here's a picture of us doing that. We have been teaching and writing about sex education for young adults, mostly college students, for about 20 years now, teaching about sexual health, sexual pleasure, consent, LGBTQ issues, sometimes together, sometimes separately. Over that period of time, we've presented about 1,200 programs in 47 states. And so today we are here to talk mostly about that work with adults and young adults.
And can I just say, like, one of the great things about working with young adults is meeting OWL graduates around the country. Sometimes we discuss with our college audiences the places people get bad or inaccurate or just incomplete sex education. And then we ask if anyone in the room got a good sex education growing up. And a few hands go up and we're like, okay, like, where did you get it? And often those students are like, church. And others in the room like craning their necks like, what? Like, who is this that's saying church? And what on earth are they talking about? Like, a lot of folks, this is not their experience in church. And then of course we ask where they go to church, and often they say UCC, and then we explain to the audience how great our denominations are in terms of sex education.
Not often say UU or UCC. They only say UU or UCC. In fact, I'm at the point now where I can sort of do a magic trick for the audience where someone's like, I got great sex education in church. And the audience gasps. And then I say, UU or UCC? And then they answer one of those two. And then the audience is like, how did she know? And then I get to go on and explain. It's kind of fun.
Yeah, and it's both sad and funny that the only other place people get a good sex education, at least, hearing from our audiences, is some people just have exceptional teachers that, despite the, limits placed on them, just figure out a way to get across a good sex education in high school or middle school. But that is so rare, and Al fills so much of that gap for our youth. But all right, so in terms of this particular project that we're talking about today, this began as an educational program, I Love Female Orgasm, and a book with that same title that was published in 2007. The book was really inclusive of LGBTQ folks by 2007 standards. But as you know, our understanding of sexuality and the language used around gender is constantly evolving and being updated. So when it came time for a second edition of the book, we were sort of thinking through how to update language, and also more fundamentally our content around transgender and non-binary folks. And in reality, like, the fundamentals of how to have an orgasm doesn't change, but the world around us does. Like, there are new sex toys and new research and new language, and incorporating all that really made the case, both to ourselves and to our publisher, for the need for a second edition. And the shift in title away from I Love Female Orgasm to I Love Orgasms reflects that inclusive title of transgender and non-binary folks, but also cisgender men and people with penises. And then we get a lot of questions around those lines of people, have questions about partners or for themselves. And it's like, why not make this an all-inclusive book while centering the information that people are interested in the most. So when it came time to write a new edition, we collaborated with one of the sex educator on our team, who's also a trainer for the Transgender Training Institute, and that's Maybe Burke, and maybe worked with us to create this updated edition. Maybe would be joining us today, except they are actually at a college right now conducting an allied training. So with all this work, we present to you I Love Orgasms, which we're excited to share with a community like Al on multiple levels. We always love a good discussion about pleasure and consent and sexual health. And as part of the research for the book, we conducted a survey of 1,569 people. And yes, we were tickled that the final number did end in 69. Like, thank you to the sex goddesses for that one. The group also included 343 transgender and non-binary people. So one of the things we'll do today is sort of share the results of that survey. It's just interesting to get a snapshot of where people are at.
Yeah, so that survey is certainly not a scientific study with a representative sample, but one thing that we find as you dive into the research about sexuality is there's so much that's not research. There's so many questions we still had that there's just nothing about. So being able to ask people questions about the things that we're looking for information on, just to hear about the diversity of people's experiences, and also to get to ask qualitative questions, let them write out their answers instead of just checking a box, and really be able to bring their voices into how we understand sexual pleasure and consent and sexual health, and also bring their voices literally into the book in the form of lots and lots of people's quotes and experiences, which often contradict each other. And isn't that what we all learn doing sex education work with any, people of any age, from adults to young kids, is one person says, this is my experience, and someone else says, that's not true for me. And then they tell you what their experience is. So I think all those voices really enriched our learning and the book itself. So the subtitle of this webinar is Pleasure, Sexual Health, and Consent. And often out there in the world, those three concepts, pleasure, sexual health, consent, are thought of as being really separate topics. A lot of traditional, if there is such a thing as traditional sex education, really focuses on sexual health, and especially all the things that can go wrong in terms of sexual health. So we educate young people about HIV prevention and STI prevention and unplanned pregnancies. And then there's lots of really wonderful work in the field of violence prevention education, which is rightfully raising people's awareness about consent, and especially everyone's right to say no to sex and all kinds of touching that we might not want. But often that education doesn't go to the next step to think about how to say yes to the sex that we do want, and figuring out what do we want and what do we say yes to. And we really think that pleasure is the thread that ties all of those things together, but is less often central to work as sex educators and in the field of sex education. So we actually wanted to pause for a moment and hear from all of you about your thoughts about why include pleasure in sex education. Does it belong here? Why? And if so, why should it be included? So we're going to invite you to put in the chat, the Zoom chat right now, why do you think pleasure should be included in sex education? We'll just pause for a moment to get your thoughts.
While you're pausing, Dorian, I just want to pop in and say that I often say that pleasure is the P word in sex education, particularly with youth and children, that it's even sometimes more controversial to talk about pleasure than to talk about penises or vaginas or vulvas or how babies are made or anything like that. So I just wanted to pop in there with that. There's such a stigma around that word that, oh my gosh, if we talk about pleasure, then it's going to mean that everybody's going to want to go do this.
Right. Absolutely. So Kathy said, because pleasure is the reason why many people choose to have sex. Yes, that in fact is, as much as we teach young people about how babies are made and penis and I was going to say penis and sperm and egg and penis and vagina and all the focus on that. Certainly the primary reason, the most common reason why most instances of sex happen and sex really broadly designed, not limited to penises and vaginas, is certainly for pleasure. I see there's an outdated, maybe religious expectation that sex is only for procreation. Yes, and certainly can sex be for procreation? Yes, but is that the only reason?
And I also see grounding sexuality as good and natural and the main motivator for trying sex.
Yeah, especially if you think about why people often get started the very first time, the very early times. We need to be talking about pleasure because it's part of the entire package, and we often forget to include that in our conversations. Yes, absolutely. And I also think I'll add to this brainstorm that I think pornography has left a lot of people really confused about pleasure. And of course, porn is so easy to access now. It doesn't require, finding a stash under somebody's bed or, sneaking off to the woods like, with somebody's magazine that you found or borrowed or stole or whatever. Porn is now accessible on the devices that parents provide to their, let's say, middle schoolers and high schoolers that they have in their pockets all day long. So the access to porn and the is just at a level that none of us have had before. Previous generations certainly didn't have. And what looks like pleasure in porn, and especially pleasure for people with vaginas, is so confusing, and often so completely disconnected, of course, from how pleasure works in the real world. So if young people are curious about what sex looks like, a curiosity we all would see as common and normal, and they're like, I wonder what sex does look like. I don't really get to see it anywhere else. They have such easy access, but what that access provides them about pleasure is just incredibly confusing. Was there anything else there in the chat that we want to?
Yeah, lots of great stuff.
Some more, Marshall, that people put in here. I'm reading them now.
Yeah, good to re-educate us that sex is not bad or something to just be tolerated or submitted to. Sort of endure if you want a baby. For older folks, nothing is more important. And the question of what are you into, inviting ourselves to think about pleasure, communicate that pleasure, and to experience the benefits of connection that are facilitated by pleasure. And clear way inappropriately introduce sexual behaviors such as molestation and rape or assault.
Yes. Oh, such a good brainstorm. So many riches there. We could talk about that for the entire rest of the hour. Mm-hmm. So yes, thank you for all those. So sometimes people say to us, and especially to me, like, how did you come to do this work? Like, how did you come to stand on a stage in front of all these students, often talking about orgasms? And the very short answer is that I didn't figure out how to have an orgasm myself until I was almost halfway through college, the very end of my sophomore year. And when I figured this out, and I should just say that, orgasms is like the marketing word, right? Orgasms are a fun word, but obviously the real topic here is pleasure that underlies orgasms. And you can have pleasure without an orgasm. An orgasm does not need to be the goal. And we certainly recognize that and teach that, but that's a lot of words. An orgasm is a short, simple thing that appeals to people. But when I finally made this discovery, when I figured out how to get there, the end of my sophomore year of college, I was like the little emoji with the exploding head. I was like, I could not believe that my body could do this incredible thing. And I wanted to learn everything I could about it. I was just completely fascinated. And I started reading and researching and eventually writing about the research that I was reading about sexual pleasure and orgasm. And that eventually led to me teaching other people about that. And then eventually sort of bringing Marshall into co-presenting these programs with me. Because we need to hear from people of all genders, and we need to talk about it as an experience that people of all genders have. So that was one piece of how I sort of landed in what is now a full-time job teaching about all these things, not only pleasure, but also consent and sexual health and LGBTQ issues. But there's another piece of my life experience that really ties in here. And that is that when I was 26 years old, I was diagnosed with breast cancer. And as you all know, being diagnosed with cancer in your 20s is really unusual. It is not a common time to it's increasingly common, I guess, but it's still a pretty small percentage of all breast cancer cases. And so, of course, they don't do routine mammograms when you're in your 20s. The way that I found out that I had breast cancer at 26 is I was lying in bed one night, I was yawning and stretching, just sort of doing this like, movement that many of us do. And I just sort of absentmindedly ran my hand down my arm and across my chest. And I noticed this little lump. And actually, Marshall was there that day. We were a couple, if that isn't already clear, for many, many years. And so I went and had this checked out. I was like, oh, what's this little lump? And I pointed out to my doctor, had tests. When my doctor finally came back and said to me some weeks later that my lump was breast cancer, I was completely floored. I did not have a single risk factor on the list for breast cancer. So I went through the whole process. I had surgeries and chemotherapy, and I lost my hair. But I look back on all this all these years later, and what strikes me, what stands out in my mind is I'm so appreciative that I had not internalized all those messages that people get that it's bad or dirty or shameful to touch your own body. Because the fact that I absentmindedly ran my hand across my breast while stretching one night, and probably I had done exactly that same motion without ever thinking about it, 1,000 times before, I noticed that little lump possibly weeks, months, years. Like, how long would it have taken for someone else to notice that I had cancer in my breast? And so with breast cancer, they never tell you that you're cured. They say it can come back anytime. But of course, the more years that go by, the better your odds. So last week, I actually celebrated my 23-year anniversary of my breast cancer diagnosis. So I am so appreciative to be here on so many levels today talking about all of this. And you can see why, for me, in my personal experience and my professional experience, these things are so intertwined. Bodies, body image, physical health, sexual health, pleasure, consent, they're all very much tied together. They are not separate, disparate topics that live on different planets. And I think for all of us, they tie together and they very much connect in all kinds of different ways. And as educators, our goal is for everybody to be able to connect with their bodies, their sexuality, their pleasure, with joy, without shame, in the ways that are right for them. And we think that would be an incredible force for good in the world.
So let's jump in. We would love to share with you some of our findings from the book that seem, particularly sort of interesting or relevant to all of our work in this field. We want to be clear, we wrote the book with an audience of adults in mind, college students and up. If you work with younger students like high school, some of this may be appropriate, some maybe not, but it's useful for our overall knowledge and certainly can apply quite directly to all levels of adult, Al. So as I mentioned before, we did the survey. Part of what was fun about doing the survey is like, okay, what are the results? Like, where are people at? One fun one to start with is erogenous zones. We asked people their favorites. We got a lot of responses on that. I know many of us who, think of erogenous zones as a way to get people thinking about sexuality beyond just their genitals. So you can see the results. A number of them all passing the 50% mark. What do we got here? Neck, lips, thigh, chest, and breasts, and nipples and butt, all super popular. Part of it was interesting too in terms of our data, and of course we asked people like lots of different questions, all of them voluntary. Any question could be skipped, but getting a sense of how different responses matched up with people's gender identity or their sexual orientation. So in terms of erogenous zones and gender, neck was the top pick for most respondents, no matter what their gender identity. But looking more closely at the data in terms of some of the other ones on the list, so like butt was the top pick for trans feminine respondents who weren't taking hormones, but for trans feminine folks who were taking hormones, breasts perked up into first place, as opposed to trans masculine folks where chest didn't even make the top 10. And this confirms for us, what a sense that, many of us know that like what one person is their favorite erogenous zone, the other person is just would make their skin crawl or like trigger their dysphoria. So encouraging people to like ask for what they like, tuning into their partner's cues, sort of having erogenous zones be a door opening to communication and learning about each other is a great thing to do no matter what your partner's gender identity. So our next set of questions that we sort of looked at, not our next set, but the next one we'd like to share was around penetration. So we asked people what their favorite position was for intercourse. And I should say, like a couple things about this data. So you look at the chart, it would look like sort of doggy style is the most popular position, which, clearly it is very popular. Although we did sort of separate out missionary and missionary with legs up. So if you combine those two, missionary is still in first place, remains a popular position for different people for all sorts of reasons. One of the things that fascinated us is in terms of dividing people up, whether or not they had a vagina or a penis, sort of whether or not they were being penetrated or the person who's doing the penetration, very, very similar results in terms of what people's favorite positions were. The only thing that sort of stood out as a statistically significant difference was around the cowgirl position. So the person being penetrated on top seemed to be more popular with the penis owners, that they like their partner on top doing all the work.
Oh, do we have that? Yeah, I'm sorry. We have a little arrow there. There you go. And I feel like we should say the reason why this is like, the second graph we're showing you is this question about sex positions and about sex positions for intercourse is a super, super common question that certainly young adults, college students are thinking about and ask us about all the time. I'm guessing high school students think about it too. I think this is also very much driven by porn, where there are a lot of positions and a lot of changing of positions, frequent changes all during the same interlude. So being able to, I think sometimes also there's sort of position of the month, position of the day, there are calendars, there are websites, there are apps, there are all sorts of things teaching people sex positions with this, I think, overemphasis on the acrobatic and the creative. And, we always tell our audiences that like, sure, if you want to sort of try like dangling upside down with one foot behind your back, just to sort of mix things up, spice things up, have a little adventure, go for it. If you can, if that works for your leg and your back. But in terms of what people really enjoy and what tends to work for pleasure, it's often like slowing things down, sticking in like one or two positions per interlude, not having a million different, position changes, which is novel for many young people now because of what they're seeing in porn. And it's always interesting that some of these things we think of as fairly traditional. In the first edition of the book, missionary came in number one. We were even a little bit surprised by that. And it's basically still there in this newer edition also. Do you have any more about that, Marshall, before we go on? Yeah,
so in terms of the webinar chat, we got a message to us hosts and panelists. Can I point out gently that the anus and anal play are not being talked about? Thank you for that. Definitely super important to talk about. In fact, we have an entire chapter just on anal sex and anal play for people of all genders and sexual orientations. This particular graph is around vaginal penetration intercourse, which was a topic that, these topics have a lot of overlap, but they also have some things that are different. One of the interesting things around anal play and anal sex that we enjoyed doing was talking about people who were assigned male at birth and therefore had prostates and the pleasure that can come from stimulating the prostate. And in the book, we have sort of a word cloud. It was an open-ended question asking people's experience with prostate stimulation, sort of what they felt. And it was the kind of thing that for a lot of people who had tried it really enjoyed it, but there were a lot of people who hadn't tried it. So it's interesting in terms of having people think about what that means in terms of their own pleasure and sexual expression, and what may be of interest to them in the future that they haven't thought about.
Yeah, and we were pretty specific in our survey questions, wanting to ask about each of those topics, about anal penetration, about vaginal penetration, about many other sexual topics. So we focused in on vaginal penetration there because of the sheer number of questions we receive about that. But certainly anal penetration is something that we talk about and teach about for sure. So then, actually, let me just stop sharing for just a moment. So one experience that I cannot tell you how many times I've had, I will teach an entire presentation about pleasure and orgasm, and we'll talk about the overemphasis of the idea that orgasms should happen with a penis inside a vagina, and that especially for vagina owners, that doesn't necessarily the most effective way to get there, and only about 30% of people with vaginas have orgasms from intercourse alone, and on and on and on and on and on. We teach about this pretty in a lot of depth. And then after the presentation is over, I'll have a line of students who are waiting to talk to me and ask me their personal questions. And very often a student will wait in a long line to talk to me. And afterwards the question will be, but I really want to learn how to have an orgasm during sex. And often what they mean is I want to have an orgasm like hands-free. Like I just want to have like that magical orgasm that I see in porn, or that I see even in just like romantic movies. And it's not happening for me. And no matter how much reassurance I give that that's common and normal, and you can have orgasms other ways, that is what people are extremely interested in. So we wanted to find out more for people who are having orgasms during vaginal penetration. If that's happening and how that's happening. And here's what our respondents found. So let's see. Here's the magical 13% who are saying penetration alone brings me to orgasm. And that's wonderful if that's a goal for those people and it makes them happy. But it's interesting how many people wish they were in that 13%. I did not lock the cat out of the room, so here comes my cat to visit me. But interestingly, these three middle categories are the clitoral stimulation categories. Clitoral stimulation from rubbing against a partner's body, or the partner's body rubbing against your own, touching your own clitoris, having a partner touch your clitoris. Those added together are, and then we'll also have a little bit smaller percentage down here using a vibrator during intercourse. For most people who have a clitoris and who are having orgasms during vaginal penetration, those are the primary ways that it's happening. And being able to tell people that, who are trying to figure this out, whether they're adults or they're high school students, they're trying to understand and make sense of what they see represented in movies and what's really happening in their own life, that letting go of the hands-free goal and recognizing that there are lots of other ways you can have an orgasm during penetration, that often works better.
Dorian, I would add that data tracks for older adults as well, adults in middle and older age.
Thank you. That's good to know. Yeah, and of course not surprising, but still good to know. Thank you for chiming in with that. And then here's another perpetual question that I'm guessing that many of you also receive, and that is, how do lesbians have sex? And it kind of makes me chuckle that people are so baffled by this. It doesn't seem like a baffling topic to me. I'm not sure it ever has, but it's really a question of like, but what if there's no penis in the room? What happens then? So we asked queer women, bi women, lesbian women, if two people who have vulvas are having sex with each other, what are your favorite things to do together? Because we can all, as educators, answer this question in ways that are affirming and inclusive. But it's nice to have some data, some stats to back up what we're saying. And indeed, the things we've been saying for many years, that when there's no penis in the room, there are lots of ways that people enjoy sex, all the same ways that people enjoy sex, even when there is a penis in the room, with fingers and with tongues and with their bodies and with sex toys. I think people often assume that it's all about strap-ons. Like what you have to do is replace the penis by using a toy that's shaped like a penis and attaching it to your body. That would be a strap-on. And in fact, yes, 6% of people with a vulva said that was one of their favorite ways to be pleasured. But using their bodies with tongues and fingers were by far the leaders in this survey question.
So one of the things that emerged from our collaborative work together, the two of us working with Maybe, was how much everyone benefits, like no matter what their gender identity or sexual orientation, from giving everyone an opportunity to learn everything. And I think a good example that really stood out for us was teaching about body tours. So the concept of a body tour is just really simple. It's like talking your partner through the different parts of your body, discussing where you like to be touched, where they can touch, where you need to, how you like to be touched, sort of what your limits are, all of that. And this approach really is intended for trans and non-binary folks to have boundaries over expectations of what pleasure might look like. But it's also really trauma-informed, regardless of gender, and can be a way to just prioritize consent and individualize pleasure. And in terms of consent, like it accomplishes a lot of work in terms of making sure that partners are on the same page with each other. And I think part of what for us has been so profound about teaching about all this is how far the idea of body tour or that level of communication is from where most young adults are at in terms of their communication in sexual situations. So one of the things we did in researching the book was to conduct focus groups of college students around the country. So we had a whole mix of schools, public and private, different parts of the country. We asked them lots of questions about their experience of sex and hookup culture, and basically just trying to understand what their sex lives are like and how that's different from what our generation or baby boomers or people who came of age in the early 2000s, like just sort of what's going on now, like on the ground. And certainly since we wrote the first edition. And I think one moment that really stood out for me in my mind as an example of this challenge is a woman shared a story where she had a regular hookup partner.
Right.
What's that? Yes, college student. She had a regular hookup partner. They would, have sex on an ongoing basis. So one day he came to her room to hook up, and she asked him when he arrived, "How was your day?" And his response to her was, "I don't want a relationship." And as she reflected on that to us, that somehow if asking how someone's day is too intimate, like outside of the bounds of hookup culture, then how on earth would she be expected to communicate anything else about consent, about what feels good to her, about what doesn't, about what she wants and doesn't want? So part of what we work with in our audiences is teaching them just if they can introduce even just a little bit more communication, like just be a little bit more verbal. Maybe they just, if something feels good, they moan a little bit, or they check in and ask for consent by something as simple as saying, "Is this okay?" or "Is this good?" Or maybe even building up the courage to be like, "That feels good," or so they wouldn't say it that way. They'd be like, "That feels good," or communicating like, "I'd rather do something else," or something be uncomfortable or beyond what they want to do. And of course, Al teaches all this, the value of communication, how to communicate. I know I'm like preaching to the choir, but I'm continually reminded, particularly in these focus groups, of just how important all of our work is and how much there is to be done. So let's pause for a moment. We have one other sort of interesting story along these lines that we wanted to share with you, but I'm curious if people have questions, thoughts, reactions about anything we've spoken about so far. So there's the chat and the Q&A.
There is one question in the Q&A. It isn't about anything that you have spoken about so far, but I'd be happy to answer it. There's a question in the Q&A of if Our Whole Lives addresses different relationship structures like polyamory. And I'll just say that we're getting questions about polyamory more and more and more. And we did do a webinar about polyamory and consensual non-monogamy. Probably a year and a half ago now. And it's on our playlist. Andrea, if you have that easily, you can pop in the chat. If not, I'll get it in a minute and pop that that URL for the playlist in there. But Our Whole Lives does talk about different relationship structures that they exist. And much like many things in Our Whole Lives, we don't take like a pro or a con stance. It's just like, this is something that people do. What might be some of the challenges, what might be some of the benefits, and depending on what age level we're at when the question comes up, there's more or less discussion about it. So do either one of you want to say anything, or did it come up in your work with your book at all?
Well, before we go to the book, Before we move on to the book, I want to mention that for folks who use the UUA version of Sexuality and Our Faith, the UUA did pass a resolution a couple years ago recognizing many kinds of family relationships and relationship styles. So that's actually in our bylaws as being more than binary type, traditional type relationships. So that's an accepted thing within our bylaws. So turn it back over to you.
I remember when that happened.
Yeah, so Dorian may have thoughts on this too. I think it's interesting, and of course, the book is written for people of all ages, but a lot of our work, and as I mentioned, involves sort of talking to young adults and in particular college students and the focus groups that I just mentioned. And I think if anything, it's not hookup culture for most of them is such a part. It's so much the norm that the idea of a relationship or being able to have relationship structures is very much out of reach. There aren't, in order to have sort of polyamory, you need, or at least most people who identify as poly, they're looking for an ongoing thing in the context of a relationship, whether that be a primary one and then additional people, or relationships with multiple people at once. I know lots of people familiar with polyamory have their entire websites and books devoted to sort of exploring possibilities, but often is relationship focused. And a lot of college students are like, we got a question. Sometimes we have a program called Sex in the Dark where we answer student sex questions that they submit. And one question was just simply like, how do I get a boyfriend? And
last night, right?
It often comes up, but this one came up. I'm thinking of a large public university in Virginia where in this case, we were mostly speaking to women who are part of sororities. So the question sort of, how do I get a boyfriend, very sort of focused on their experience. We opened that up to sort of a group brainstorm, which they could submit, anonymously what their thoughts were on this. And in the end, it was like, it's hard. It may just simply be luck. But there's no sort of one way to be able to find a boyfriend that's sort of kind of like out of reach for a lot of people, which I think many people, sort of older generations, may find kind of sad. But it's it's the world that today's college students are sort of living in and have to figure out how to navigate.
And as you probably know, teens and college students today are having a lot less sex. Like there's a downward trend. They're having sex later. They're having less of it overall. We could talk about why. I think one obvious piece of why is they're spending a lot more time on their phones and a lot less time with each other in person. But it's a complicated and interesting scenario.
I see a question that came in. Do you want to take that one, Dorian?
I'm an older adult and have only recently, and we do have an interesting story, as Marshall mentioned, that I still do want to circle back to. I'm an older adult and have only recently experienced both my partner and I having orgasms at the same time. Is this a common or an uncommon experience? I think a lot of people try hard to have simultaneous orgasms, and often it's a lot of work and doesn't work out. So I think our message on that is, if it happens for you, fabulous. And if it's something you enjoy, fabulous. But it doesn't need to be the goal. There's no reason why having orgasms at the same time is better in the hierarchy. There doesn't need to be a hierarchy at all. So as long as both people are experiencing pleasure in a way that is right for them, feels good for them, that they enjoy, that balance is what it's about, as opposed to having them at the same time or different times. But if it's happening for you at the same time, I think that probably aligns with a lot of, again, what you see in the movies and probably what people read in romance novels and all the other sources where we get those cultural scripts for what sex looks like. So I think it's probably not super common, but awesome if it's working for you and feeling good for you both.
So we're happy to answer more questions. We did have one story that we wanted to share with you that we found sort of really interesting, particularly along the lines of the fun of writing a second edition and be like, what has happened since then? What have we learned? And in the first edition of the book, we reported on some sort of fascinating conclusions of a book called The Technology of Orgasm. And the idea from that book was that until sort of like ancient times, until the 1920s, doctors basically massaged women's genitals to orgasm as a kind of like accepted medical treatment for this condition known as hysteria. And the author of that book, basically her argument was, when the vibrator was invented, doctors turn to the machines to do the work because, why have a machine do, why do by hand what a machine could do for you, like saving time and effort. And of course, since this made going to the doctor quite fun, many women came in for regular treatments. And then it was like the explanation for sort of why the shift happened was that everyone was so clueless about the clitoris that no one thought of this as kind of like a sexual thing. So the author would have us believe. And part of the reason why we found really, helpful to talk about this among anybody in the sexuality field is how much this story went viral and many people think of it as fact. Like the idea that the people going to doctors week after week for like clitoral stimulation sessions. This has been cited in the scholarly literature. It has made it into films. It was in a Tony-nominated play. The book was translated into multiple languages. It even has been cited in court cases. And like many sex educators, we've been reporting this as fact until credit to Melanie Davis for tipping us off. And I should add a huge shout out to both Melanie and Amy for reading drafts of the book and giving us lots of feedback, super helpful. This being a good example of that. And Melanie was like, you might want to do some Googling and find out more about this. And indeed, there's just simply no evidence of this, that anything in the book was true in terms of doctors providing clitoral stimulation or using vibrators to simplify their task. There were two researchers at the Georgia Institute of Technology, and I will drop in the chat a link to their piece. It's a journal article, but it's written in fairly accessible, friendly manner, sort of taking this apart piece by piece. But one of the conclusions of the authors, she later wrote this in a New York Times op-ed, which summed it up well, that doctors had invented vibrators as cure-all devices. But those devices ended up curing very little until our great-great-grandmothers put them towards their highest purpose. So if you're interested in reading more about all that, you can check out that link.
It's always interesting in every field to discover which of the things that you've always believed or been taught or maybe taught yourself are true and which ones turn out to be myths or have no evidence behind them whatsoever. So that was quite surprising to us.
So go ahead, Dorian.
So should I talk about our discount code or switch over?
Great.
Okay, so we have set up a discount code for buying an autographed copy of the book if you're interested. For OWL participants, you can get 20% off, and the discount code is OWL23. Are you putting that in the chat? Oh, it looks like Andrea did it. Thank you for that. So that's available to you. It's also available at stores and on Amazon and all the other regular places, your favorite independent bookstore. So we wanted to make sure to leave plenty of time to hear from you and talk about the things that you're interested in and answer your questions. So we're happy to spend some time doing that now.
If he has any questions, please do pop them in the Q&A feature. That'll be really helpful for us. I just want to thank you so much. I think your work is so important. I love how research-based it is and how connected to understanding the real experiences of people. Because as sexuality educators, and I think, like one thing that stuck out to me so much, but what you both said was like, we've got so much work to do, right? Because we do, and our whole lives is something that is still so unusual, right? It's an unusual experience for youth and young adults to receive comprehensive, inclusive, lifespan sexuality education. And it's connected not only to safety, like you were saying, Dorian, around preventing unwanted pregnancies, unintended pregnancies, health issues around sexually transmitted infections, but it's also such a life skill, right? About being able to say what you want and what you don't want in your relationships and in relationship to your bodies. So it's so important. And that idea of pleasure as being something that we should talk about, because if it's not pleasurable, then what does that mean? That doesn't feel consensual. That doesn't feel healthy. If, like someone had put in the chat earlier, it's just something you have to get through. or you should just do it. So, these things are all connected. They aren't, as you said, they aren't like these separate topics. Melanie, did you want to add anything in here?
I just think to reiterate the importance of consent with orgasms and pleasure, the people who are looking to have pleasurable sex, if they're having sex they don't want, the odds of it being pleasurable, yes, our bodies will do some things physiologically that we, don't have any control over, but to add the emotional element of pleasure, consent is super, super important. And I'm wondering, in your work with college students, you had mentioned at the start that people worry about offending somebody if they say no. Are you seeing any kind of change over time? Are people becoming more aware of their right to say no, or of the importance of consent?
I think the answer is yes, that awareness is growing, that students, we've now, the Me Too movement and the focus on consent has been around for enough years that there certainly is more awareness and more young people, I think, thinking about consent, I would say, than was the case 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. But I think figuring out how to actually communicate it in ways that don't feel unbearably awkward to them is still a challenge. I think lots of people are, college guys are very worried about being accused of sexual assault or something the person didn't consent to. What if someone changes their mind? What if they, what if they change the story the next day? There's lots of anxiety around that. And the number one thing that I hear is students doing things they don't want to do because they don't want to hurt the other person's feelings. They figure if I say no, if I've got myself this far, however far they are in their sort of being together in some kind of intimate way or sexual way, that to stop things or to change direction might hurt their partner's feelings, to say no in any way. And so a lot of students are like, well, it's not that big a deal. I'll just do whatever the thing is my partner thinks we're going to do next, which is so troubling. And figuring out how to help students, we talk about just embracing the awkward, the inherent, sometimes it's going to be awkward. When someone invites you over for dinner and you don't want to go to that person's house for dinner, you don't want to eat with them, they're boring or they're mean or whatever, you're busy. You have to figure out how to do that thing of saying no politely or evading, or we have to navigate this as adults. And sometimes we give honest answers. And sometimes, to be really frank, we say, oh, I'm so sorry, I'm not available that night, when really we just don't want to go. And I think that's okay. It's okay for a dinner invitation because you don't want to hurt someone's feelings who's generously invited you over. And I think it's also okay to say, I'm so sorry, I'm not feeling that well. I'm so sorry, my roommate needs me. And just give some reason to get out of there. In a way that doesn't make a big deal out of it and doesn't hurt the person's feelings. That's sort of how we navigate the etiquette of saying no in our society. We might wish that we could all be honest 100% of the time. I think sometimes giving young people permission to use any number of strategies to decline invitations or expectations that we're not interested in, that's okay too.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, just quickly, I think, the challenge of, there's an increased awareness that if someone says no, that should be respected. There's increased awareness about the role in which alcohol plays in consent and how incapacitation, people cannot consent to have sex if they're incapacitated. There's increased awareness of sort of power differentials in terms of consent. Like, all of those things have raised awareness. I think as Dorian's saying, part of the challenge, the work next to be done as the culture, is if someone says yes to the basic sense of like, okay, I'm interested in having sex with this person. What then happens to give people tools around communication and also around consent as well, to shape what happens next in a way that's sort of positive and that feels good to get them, and it has to have values of being mutually pleasurable and like all of those aspects of it, like having safer sex and all of those things, which those tools are really lacking on a lot of levels. And Al tries to fill the gap, but there are a lot of people, as we know, unfortunately, this is not a program that everyone in the country gets to go through before they
will grow. Sure.
Well, yeah, and we're all for everybody for no. But I think I think that's one of the things that Al does really well, is to give people in many ages of the curriculum opportunities to consider awkward situations and to role play scenarios around awkward situations and what they might say, or to observe other people role playing that to see what they might say, just to give you some practice in that, so you're not just caught cold in XYZ awkward situation. It isn't, that is something, those skills that you're talking about, both of you, are things that, many adults struggle with too. And we have lots of messages, especially I think for those of us on the call that are, have been raised Christian or in a Christian community, about honesty, right? So having permission to say, I need to find a way to get out of this, and to think about that ahead of time. Like, if I am going to go have this encounter and I decide that there's something going on that I just don't want to do, and it feels awkward and I need to say something, what could I say? And, have an agreement with your roommate that they need you whenever you say that they need you. And so if you need to do that, so you feel like you're not lying. I mean, there's lots of things that people can do around that. And I appreciate the person in the chat saying, boy, I really would feel horrible if somebody played along and then I found out about that they played along with me later. I would feel bad about that myself. So I think it's complicated, right? Like, there aren't these easy answers for how to navigate these things.
And one of the things that parents can do to support high school and middle school children and teens is to set up a system with texting. And, if I text the number, 80 to you, mom, that means you need to call me and say, get your butt home, you're in trouble, or whatever, so that the parents and the youth and teens become partners in healthy decision-making and getting out of trouble if you're in a bind. There is a question in the Q&A that's asking if you have run into issues related to censorship, or if anybody has complained that as sex educators, you might be grooming people.
You want to answer that, Marshall?
Yeah, I mean, so it's an interesting question. In terms of being around college students, well, let me put it this way. I think there's sort of a national debate, and which the question is clearly referring to, in terms of what books high school and middle school students should have access to, what information. And of course, this has been going on for years. And part of what's nice about Al being, primarily in faith communities, is to be like, yes, like in our community, this is what we're gonna teach, and not have to be subject to a debate around that involves politics and school boards and things like that. I think what we're seeing is, while people debate this on sort of a national level, what the students themselves are doing is, like, if I have a sex question, I'm going to go to TikTok or Instagram, or I'm going to Google it, or YouTube, but usually TikTok these days. And that has its own challenges. One of the things we also do work in some independent boarding schools in terms of working with high school students. And one of the things we help them think through are what are some good, accurate sources of information about sex and what could get you off track. And recognizing that just because somebody is an Instagram influencer, likewise on TikTok, that the information they're putting out there may or may not be accurate, which I think is sad. I mean, it's just one of the ways in which the sort of technology gives people a lot of access to information, but it would be great recognizing as Dorian said earlier, the click of a few buttons to be able to access porn and be able to access people put themselves out there as sex educators who may or may not have any training whatsoever, as opposed to the good information that a curriculum like Al, that's been vetted and has critical readers and has gotten feedback over many years, that's what they're getting instead. So
yeah, and I would just add too, thanks, Marshall. And it's so live right now too, right? Being accused of being groomers and that kind of thing. And so I really appreciate your nuancing, like, sex education isn't all the same, right? What people call sexuality education. Developmentally appropriate, comprehensive education that follows, like, the national sex ed standards and those kind of things, like OWL does, right? That kind of sexuality education, we know, does the opposite of grooming, that it actually empowers children and young people to have more agency over their bodies it doesn't prevent all abuse by any stretch, but it does have kind of like a prophylactic effect in some ways in terms of the empowerment. Sometimes then somebody will not target someone who feels more empowered with their body. They will look for people who are more vulnerable. And if something does happen, then people have the language to talk about it and are more likely to report. So those are some things that we know. And but that's not like watching a TikTok influencer. Okay, I've just got to say I'm old enough that saying the word influencer like it's an actual thing is just still weird for me. Okay. But you know, like that's not the same kind of sexuality education. So there may be some people out there calling themselves sexuality educators who are not doing a great job, right? And who are not in the same kind of thoughtful, research-based, you know, really good sexuality education that the four of us here are invested in. Yeah. Well, we are almost to the top of the hour. I don't see any more questions in the Q&A. So I'm going to say thank you so much. Just everybody go get this book. It's really fabulous. It's amazing and it's easy to read. They have chapters about all kinds of topics. It's really fantastic and inclusive. I really hope that you'll support their amazing work and they gave you a 20% discount. What's not to love about that?
The
also,
coupon code,
go ahead.
the coupon code is in the chat. And could you hold your book up again just so that people can see the lovely cover?
There. Woohoo.
If you're watching.
Thank you for the chance to talk about it and to talk about pleasure for an hour with all of you.
If you're watching this after the fact and you cannot see the chat, we will put the discount code and how to use it and where to use it in the information underneath the video on the YouTube channel. So you should have that. And if you said that you would like to, you were willing to receive communications from the UCC, then you'll get a follow-up email after this webinar and we will put it in there as well. Ken is asking, do you think that book could make it on a Florida school shelf? And the answer would be probably not in 2023, but who knows? Melanie, would you like to tell us what's coming up in March for March 1st?
Yeah, so we're completely switching gears. Our guest will be Dr. Verena Brown, who is a pediatrician in Atlanta, and her specialty is child protection. So that means educating parents, educating medical professionals about child sexual abuse and how to prevent it to the best of people's ability. And we will be talking about you know, what to look for, what to listen for, when to do mandatory reporting. And she is one of the nation's experts in this area. So we're pleased to be able to welcome her next month.
Thank you again, Marshall and Dorian. Thank you everyone for joining us today. This is recorded, so we will have it up on our Whole Lives Taking Flight YouTube channel by the end of the week. And thank you so much, and we hope to see you again.
Thank you. Bye-bye.